You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? Hello, and welcome back to Romancing in Paris. I hope you enjoyed the last episode on the Place Saint-Georges, a lovely square in the heart of the 9th. Today we're hopping over to the next district, the 10th. This very central right bank district isn't among the most romantic in the city, and it didn't always have such a great reputation, but it's seen a steady evolution over the last 20 years. First, thanks to the cleaning up and trendification of the Canal Saint-Martin. You can learn about it in our second episode on the 10th arrondissement. We also covered a charming, lesser-known square in the 10th, the Place France-Liszt, in our first episode on the 10th, which remains one of my all-time favorite episodes, as it has quite a fascinating story behind it. Or more precisely, its namesake, and the square itself has many romantic qualities. So, what to cover next in the 10th? Well, in this episode, I wanted to highlight a different sort of place. One which has a special hidden feel. Grab your chérie, we're going to la Cour des Petites Écuries. Sandwiched between Rue d'Anguin and Rue des Petites Écuries, and with the main entrance off of Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, you mightn't have even noticed the entrance into this pedestrian lane if you were walking up the increasingly hip and very busy street, the Faubourg Saint-Denis. However, once inside the 60-meter-long lane, you enter something of a magical haven, even when it's buzzing with revelers on Friday and Saturday nights. Just beyond this hubbub is a tranquil, peaceful place to stroll. But I'll get around to all of this a bit later. First, I'd like to tell you about the lane's history. As we've discussed in a few previous episodes, Paris used to be encircled by fortification walls. The city outgrew its initial set of walls, and thus they were expanded, and a few times afterwards. In fact, just up the street, running along Les Grands Boulevards, which still acts as the border between the 10th and the 3rd and 2nd districts, was Paris's second wall, commissioned by King Charles V in the mid-1300s. Beyond this wall were the suburbs, or faubourg, boroughs in French, which you might recall was the name of the street adjacent to our lane I just mentioned, the Faubourg Saint-Denis. I went into detail on the surprising history of the Rue Saint-Denis, the extension into Paris of this street, in the second episode of my other podcast, Paris Cachet. In case you'd like to learn a little bit more about it, I suggest you dig up that episode. The Charles V wall was dismantled in 1670. However, a few years later, in 1674, King Louis XIV added the triumphal archways which sit where the former Porte Saint-Martin and Porte Saint-Denis city gates of the wall had been. These commemorate military victories of the Sun King, but also acted as a separation from Paris and its then suburbs. Paris was encircled again in the 1780s with a wall called the Mur des Fermiers Généraux. This was a taxation wall, which was in turn torn down in 1860. Its former line traces the top of the 10th arrondissement, and that of the other districts in the outer part of the city. I'm explaining all of this as it pertains to the history of our lane. In 1755, shortly before the wall was expanded, les Petites Écuries du Roi, a Parisian annex of Louis XV's royal stables at Versailles, were established on the land where our lane is found. This is where horses, carriages, and coaches were rented out to aristocratic gentlemen. This is how our lane was created in 1769 as part of this stable complex. The location of our lane also has a possible romantic connection. You see, it's thought that it was on this very land where there used to be an elegant 17th century estate owned by Ninon de l'Enclos, one of the most legendary women in France. Ninon was a famous courtesan and then writer who held a popular salon at her everyday residence, which was located in some apartments within a private mansion in the Marais. Perhaps Ninon received some of her lovers here at her more spacious estate at the edge of the city. Love must be ingrained into the site, or that's what I'd like to think. After the Revolution, the area saw some of its own evolution. The south part of the Faubourg Saint-Denis had an industrial side to it, with small factories and workshops. But further north, a new district was built in the 1820s onwards, called La Nouvelle France, or New France. We covered this in more detail in our episode on Place France Liszt. In 1819, an exit to our lane was opened up on the other side from the Faubourg Saint-Denis, Rue d'Anguin. A little later in the century, a free drawing school for workers of the neighborhood industries appeared on this lane. Yet, these industries, all the factories and workshops, began disappearing over the second half of the 1900s, and thus ended the industrial qualities of the area. In the early 2000s, our lane saw its last major modification, a tiny alley which was added in the northwest end, connecting it up to La Rue des Petites Écuries. So nowadays, it's almost a T-shaped lane. Now that we've covered more about the history of the lane, shall we take a little saunter down it? I would suggest entering it via the Faubourg Saint-Denis side, as it gives a nice surprise effect. You can find this tucked between the buildings of 61 and 63 Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. You can simply take a slow walk down it with your chérie and soak up the ambiance. It makes for a perfect romantic stroll and quiet place to steal a kiss. But it also has a wide variety of bars and restaurants, making it a great all-in-one date spot for those looking to mingle with hip locals. The most notable of these, romantically speaking, is found midway down the lane at number 7. This is the historic Brasserie Flodera. For a long time, it had shortened its name to the Brasserie Flo, and was part of a group of historic brasseries dotting the country. It's now returned to its full name. During and just after the Second Empire, from the 1850s to 80s, there was a huge increase in Alsatian breweries in Paris, or brasseries. These specialized in beer and inexpensive dishes from eastern France. Around 1886, Jean Wattenlengner opened a Dépôt de Bière, a drinking establishment at number 7 Cour des Petites Écuries. This was taken over by a certain Robert Flodera in 1901, who decorated it in a classic style. Not really Art Nouveau, but lovely, with wood paneling, stained glass windows, and paintings depicting the glory of Gabnerus, the king of beer. Perfect for a beer hall, after all. In 1918, the Germanic-sounding name was shortened to Flo to avoid any possible anti-German sentiments after World War I. This explains its name evolution. You can simply admire the beautiful facade, but inside you'll feel like you're traveling back to the turn of the 20th century, or at least to present-day Alsace. Paris attracts a whole range of fascinating creatives. Discover some profiles of some of the best contemporary artists, dancers, poets, designers, and all sorts of other creatives on the City of Muses podcast, hosted by Jennifer Garrity and available on Paris Underground Radio.
And now back to Romancing in Paris.
There are a few more restaurants on the road, modern ones, which are also suitable for a date. Back at the beginning of the lane, at number 1, is the great pizzeria Lucky Luciano. For a glass of wine and modern meal, there's the nice bistro called Gros, G-R-O-S, at number 4. They also do a creative brunch on Sundays. And on the other side of the street is a place called Tempête, or the Storm, an inventive wine bar that also does small plates and has a hip vibe. If none of these options grabs your fancy, there are tons of restaurants around the corner on the ever-evolving Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. If you're looking for a casual drink, then you can stop in at popular watering holes Blue Cerise or Au Petit Paris, found at number 6 and 8 respectively. These are better in summer and for a drink on their terrace, as the inside can get rather noisy and maybe isn't the best for a date. Beer lovers may prefer to wait until the end of the lane and go to IBU or IBU, found around the corner at number 20. It's a craft beer bar which has a changing roster of around 10 different beers on tap, as well as some wine options and artisanal charcuterie and cheese plates. If you're interested in more romancing in the area, I highly recommend you go back and listen to the episodes on the Canal Saint-Martin and Place France-Liszt, so you can add these to a visit to the Cour des Petites Écuries and have the perfect romantic outing in the tents. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you have a minute, ratings or reviews are always highly appreciated. And you can find more great date ideas and other romantic things to do in Paris and around the world on my website, jetemmeneither.com. And for more great podcasts on Paris and France, check out the Paris Underground Radio website. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.